Thank you all for coming. I've been joking that it's great to have such a big turnout and everything. I think just putting Paul Krugman's name in the title might be sufficient to generate that, especially with the word wrong in the title as well. So again, thank you all for coming. There are handouts, I know, on the seats that sort of from PowerPoint I have, and I'll refer to those every once in a while as I go along. So what I want to do in about 25 minutes plus or minus, and we'll have some time for questions, is again to talk about why Paul Krugman is wrong about the recession. And I want to do this in two parts. The first half will be why he's wrong about what caused the recession. The second half about why he's been wrong about what to do about it. So that's the game plan. And certainly with a platform at the New York Times, Paul Krugman is a very, his voice is very loud in the conversation among economists about in the United States and really around the world. I understand he was over here recently and got a great deal of media attention and so on about the issues involving the Great Recession, about the causes and cures. And I think if you sort of listen to Krugman, what you end up hearing is a narrative something like the following, that the Great Recession was caused by Bush-era deregulation of finance that let banks go on to do all kinds of wild speculative sprees with no government oversight whatsoever. This supposed deregulation was aided and abetted by right-wing, crazy, laissez-faire economists, including Bush's advisors, Alan Greenspan, and all the rest of the bad guys in Krugman's world. And so those two things together, of course, led to the Great Recession. Finding ourselves in that recession, Krugman has argued that the only way out, or at least the best way out, is massive fiscal stimulus. Governments must deficit spend extraordinary amounts to boost aggregate demand and to get the Keynesian multiplier process going and get us out of the recession. And despite the fact that stimulus has been tried and not done much, Krugman and people like him continue to argue we must do more, right? You know, the leeches didn't cure the patient, more leeches, more leeches. Okay, so one round of stimulus is enough. Krugman said it was never enough. If you go back and look what he said at the time, that's not so clear. He actually said that, but now he's saying more and more and more. So again, I want to argue that this is wrong. I'll give you this sort of short version of what I want to argue, and then I'll do so in a little bit more detail. I think both, again, his diagnosis of disease and his recommended cure are problematic. To start off, there was no laissez-faire deregulation in the 1990s and 2000s. Instead, what we had that caused the Great Recession is a combination of three things, and this is going to be a little bit US-centric, but I think the spillover effects to the rest of the world come in the consequences of this. What we had, at least in the US, what we had was a combination, again, of three things. First, a credit expansion generated by the Fed, and I'll talk about the details of that, but the Fed pushed interest rates artificially low, created a great deal of credit. That's the fuel for the housing boom. That was egged on by, or at least directed into housing by, really misguided US housing policy, and this was true in other countries as well, that artificially supported the purchases of houses. Again, US in particular, but other places as well. A few countries who didn't do this, by the way, my friends in Canada being one, came out of this thing a lot better than places that did. And what this manipulation of the mortgage market did was to channel the funds from the credit expansion of the Fed into that particular industry. And so what we had happen, of course, in the industry was rising house prices. We had all these financial instruments, mortgage-backed securities and so on, being built on the premise of rising house prices and the belief, in some sense, that those prices would never come down. Thrown on top of all of that was, in the U.S., we had the organizations whose job it was to rate securities, Standard & Poor's, and Moody's, Fitch, and those three, which acted and were, in fact, at the time, not anymore, a government-sponsored or government-protected cartel. Those three organizations were the only three organizations who could rate particular kinds of securities like these. With that cartel, they couldn't recognize the mistakes they were making. They ended up serving more of the interests of the issuers of those securities than the buyers of those securities. And so we had what turned out to be garbage securities being rated AAA by these guys and so forth. So those three things together, I think, explain how we got in this mess. And again, I'll go in more detail in just a second. The result, of course, is the recession and the financial crisis. What is interesting about this recession, of course, one was its depth, but two, its kind of lingering refusal to recover. And I think that's the other piece of this puzzle that's important too. Fiscal stimulus, again, we tried it, it hasn't worked, and I would argue it's still not the answer. What we have done in the last 4 years is to turn what should have been a market correction into a Great Recession through unwise government policy. the solution is not more hair of the dog. It was excessive government intervention that caused this problem. That's not going to be the cure. And the reason that Krugman, I think, and others misunderstand this point is that they misunderstand the nature of market coordination, and especially the role played by capital, and therefore they understand what's needed to fix things. And we'll put the word fix in kind of quotes there. The fix, as I'm going to argue, can only come from the market itself, not from the blunt instrument of government. So, expanding on all this, why did we see this recession happen? And if you listen to a lot of the popular talk about the recession, oftentimes the explanations boil down to, well, people were greedy or people were irrational. And let me address the irrationality first. Suppose that while we sit in here for the next hour plus or so, when we get out, we all kind of check our Blackberries, because we're not doing it while I'm talking, of course. We get out, we discover that in central London there were several thousand automobile accidents in the last hour. Now, how would we explain this? It's certainly possible that Londoners went psychotic, right? They just went crazy and decided to ram cars into one another. But I don't think we'd find that a very satisfying explanation. What's the more likely explanation? Assuming the sun stays out into the
Traffic lights.
Traffic lights are, let's be precise, they're malfunctioning. But if they went out, let's say all the traffic lights went out, I don't think we'd see all those accidents, because people would recognize they're out, right, and they'd start treating things as four-way stops. We saw some of this in the US, like after Hurricane Katrina. What if all the lights went green? Right? If all the lights went green, everyone would figure, well, it's okay to go, and we'd have massive accidents. That's one way to think about what happened in the course of the 2000s. The credit expansion turned all the lights green. Everybody thought they could borrow, everybody thought they could build these houses, everybody thought they could do these things, and as it were, get away with it. And they couldn't. And it's not because people were irrational. They were responding rationally to an irrational mistaken signal, namely the artificially low interest rates. Just as these auto accidents, we wouldn't say, well, drivers were irrational. They saw a green light means go, you go. It's the signal that was wrong, and that was the problem we faced in the economy over the 2000s, first decade of the century, was that we had all the lights were green, thanks to the Fed and other central banks. As far as greed goes, as my colleague and friend Larry White likes to say, blaming greed for recessions is like blaming airplane crashes on gravity. Okay? Gravity's always there. Gravity doesn't help us explain why planes crash, right? Just that if something goes wrong, planes will fall. And the same thing in economy. Self-interest is always there. The question is, why did, in this case, self-interest lead to such disastrous results? And again, I think the answer goes back to the kinds of signals and incentives being set up by credit expansion and by other kinds of government policy. In particular, when we recognize the role played by interest rates as intertemporal coordinators, that interest rates coordinate the desire to save, the desire to invest, they help people make decisions through time. And when we see that when interest rates are artificially low, the signal it sends is that people are patient, they want to wait for things, that longer term investments are a better idea. When those rates are artificially low, though, that's a false signal, and people really aren't willing to wait, but it looks like they are. And so people begin to borrow and invest in these longer term projects, but people really don't want to wait that long. They want, at least in relative terms, things in the present. And so when those rates are too low, we begin to see people doing, historically investing in other kinds of things, but in this case, over-investing in housing and the related financial structure that was built on top of it. What we had after 9/11 really was an unsustainable boom in the United States and elsewhere. That these artificially low interest rates generated growth that wasn't real, that could not be sustained. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as to what that means for how we might deal with the consequences. If you want to take a look at the handout, there's a couple of graphs in the handout that show the real and nominal interest rates, Fed funds rate in the United States, and you can see, it's hard to see with the small, if I had big PowerPoint it'd be clearer, but you can see this period in the mid-2000s when that Fed funds rate was down about 1%. And if you look at the real Fed funds rate, which is the one to the right there, I think yours is, looks a little different. The one to the right is the nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate, and if you look carefully, there was this whole period that roughly same period there, that it was below zero. That when the real interest rate is negative, essentially what's happening is people are being paid to borrow, okay? And if you're going to pay people to borrow, guess what? You're going to get a lot of borrowing. You're going to get too much borrowing. And so what we do see is that the Fed did expand credit, did drive down interest rates artificially low. A lot of that was the concern about the recession related to 9/11 and so forth. But the reality is that those rates were too low, and the result was the boom. One of the important things to recognize here is that it's during the boom period where people make the mistakes. The overbuilding of housing and overbuilding of other kinds of construction and all of the financial instruments built on top of that, those were the mistakes. It's during the bust, it's during the recession that mistakes get corrected. And this, I think, if you understand that point, begins to shed some light on why we've seen this thing linger on and why we haven't been able to deal with it. Because what has to happen during a recession is the correcting of mistakes. The fact is that resources have been misallocated and need to be to use a sort of invented term, unallocated and then reallocated to different uses. That's what recovery consists in, right? Is finding those alternative, more valuable uses. But you can only understand that if you understand that the mistakes are being made during the boom. What looks like the good time is when people are making the errors because they're, again, following these false signals. In the U.S., again, this was complicated or at least directed into the housing market through a whole bunch of problematic housing policy. I won't go through all the details, but organizations like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which are government-sponsored enterprises that were designed to artificially, again, create this market for housing and for mortgages and for mortgage-backed securities. The federal government also had a big push for affordable housing. There were mandates from Congress to expand homeownership by minority groups. There were also mandates to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac about how many loans they would make to poorer households as well. All of these things together meant that there was this, again, enormous push to expand the housing market. The result of that was, again, boom in housing prices and all these other things, all these other financial instruments that we know went on top of that. It is interesting, I think, by the way, that we hear politicians in the States and elsewhere say things like, we need to make housing more affordable. And then when housing prices fell, they said, oh, we can't have housing prices fall. Okay, wait a second. That doesn't. This is how politicians think, apparently. So the result of all this, again, was the boom, and then the bust that began, at least depending how you want to date it, 2006, 7, or 8. The recession officially in 2007. And technically in the U.S., we are out of the recession right now, at least according to those who make these official determinations. But certainly here in the U.S. and it's elsewhere, we're seeing this very slow recovery. I was in a conversation this morning, and I mentioned that I refer to what we have right now as the barbecue economy. If you know how to cook barbecue, you cook it low and slow. Okay, and that's the economy we're in right now, a sort of low and slow growth. And I think in parts of Europe we're certainly seeing perhaps even negative growth rates and the prospect of slipping officially anyway back into a recession. So what do we do in a recession? Well, we thought we'd killed off Keynesianism, but people like Krugman and Brad DeLong and others, zombie-like rose from the grave to say, well, we got to have massive fiscal stimulus, and that was the conventional wisdom. The Obama administration early on gave us about $800 billion of stimulus. They laid out their case for that stimulus, by the way, with a chart, and that chart appears in the handout. It's what I call the chart of failure. I wish it were bigger, it would be a little bit easier to see, but I'll try to guide you through it. This is the chart they proposed in the fall of 2008 when sort of Obama took office. The dark low line is what they said the unemployment rate in the US would be if we passed the stimulus. The kind of lighter line curve above it is what the Obama administration and the economists they said unemployment would be if we did not pass the stimulus. The dots above all that are the actual unemployment rate. Okay? So the short version is the actual unemployment rate in the United States has been worse with the stimulus than what the Obama administration said it would be without the stimulus. So it's not just that the stimulus hasn't helped, it's actually arguably made matters worse. Now again, what Krugman and DeLong and so forth would say is, oh, well, it's because it wasn't big enough, and critics of this have said, well, of course, the economists estimated this before they knew how bad the economy was. Okay, somehow that lets them off the hook. They didn't realize how bad things were. All right, I don't think so. And by the way, what's interesting about this particular version, if you look really carefully, up here in the corner you'll see another little dot and an explanation up there. And I don't know if the color shows, but there's a green dot up there. What that green dot shows is what the unemployment rate in the United States would be if the labor force participation rate were the same. Because what's happened in the US, and I suspect elsewhere as well, I don't know the data, is that over the last few years, people have given up looking for jobs. As they give up looking for jobs, they exit the labor force. They're no longer counted as unemployed, they're out of the labor force. And the labor force participation rate falls. If we had the same LFP, labor force participation rate, that we did in 2008, the US unemployment rate would be about 11, I can't remember the exact number, 11.3, I think, percent, compared to about 8% right now. So again, this does not look good for the advocates, the Krugman type advocates of fiscal stimulus. By the way, one point about that green dot is, to be fair, labor force participation rates, particularly among men, have been slowly falling over the 20th and 21st century. So that probably overstates matters a little bit, but just a little. It's clearly the case that one of the results of this recession, and the slow recovery in particular, has been a fall in labor force participation rates, people just giving up looking for work. So what should we do? All right. What people like Krugman say is they go back to the very basic Keynesian model. And it's interesting to me, for all the fancy models that economists have developed, and I think better ones since the Keynesian revolution, it's when you find yourself in a significant crisis, it's like, you know, atheists in foxholes, right? Everyone just runs back to their intermediate macroeconomics, basic, simple Keynesian story, which is something like the following. If you want growth, right, you know, those who've taken a little economics might remember that they'll form the C plus I plus G equals Y, which is consumption plus investment plus government spending give you total GDP. And so the argument is, well, C plus I, that's the private sector, that's not doing so well, we need more G. Lots more government spending, bigger deficit, that'll boost GDP aggregate demand up that way. By the way, the problem in recessions is not, despite what you often hear in the media, consumption. If you look at consumption expenditures, they vary not very much at all. The problem is private sector investment. Private sector firms in the US and elsewhere are simply not engaged in serious investment. That's the most variable component of GDP, and that's the one that moves with the cycle. What defines a recession is a falling off of investment. And in the US, private sector investment has just not made the recovery that it normally does. I'll talk about why in a little bit. What Krugman and others argue is it doesn't much matter where the government spending is, as long as it starts the spending process and generates employment and sort of starts what we refer to as the Keynesian multiplier process. The problem is that arguments at this level of aggregation, tacitly if not explicitly, assume that all of the idle labor, that is, all of the unemployed labor, and all of the idled capital are sufficiently fungible or homogeneous that they can be put to whatever use is necessary as determined by the direction of stimulus spending. The argument you hear the Krugmans make is, how do we put people back to work? And again, not that we shouldn't be concerned about this, but the phrasing of that question is problematic. Because what I want to argue is the real question is not how do we put people back to work, but how do we know what kinds of production is able to make use of the particular people with their particular skills and the particular capital goods with the limited uses they have back to work. It's not as if we have unemployed construction workers, we can't start creating jobs in finance. We need to be the jobs and the production possibilities that we need in the recovery have to match the particular skills of capital and labor. And this is, I think, where the Krugman view gets off the rails and where a more Austrian school approach to these things is more helpful. In particular, Austrians have long argued that the nature of capital goods, and by implication human capital, labor, matters. And the market process that determines how they get used matters a great deal. One of the things that Austrians say about capital, again, including human capital, is that it has multiple but not an infinite number of uses. As my friend Pete Boettke likes to say, capital is not clay. It's not Play-Doh that you can manipulate into any shape you want. It's more like Legos, right? Lego toys that can be only structured together in specific kinds of ways. Actually, my preferred way of thinking about this is to think about the economy like a jigsaw puzzle. Okay? If you think about jigsaw puzzles, the pieces have to fit together in certain ways. You can't just take any two pieces out of the box. You've got to cram them together, right? They interlock in particular ways, and they form a particular pattern. Now, the interesting thing is, if you think about economies this way, you recognize this importance of how things fit together. Unlike real jigsaw puzzles, though, economies don't have there's not a picture out there that we're trying to create, right? We sort of don't have the image on the box. We're trying to fit the pieces together and create something that we can't quite define until it starts to emerge. But what we do have in a market economy are signals. We have prices and profits and losses that tell us when these pieces fit together and when they don't. And that's the key. When prices and profits and losses are working well, it tells us, hey, these two pieces fit. They make something people want to buy. That's good. Keep doing things like that. If those signals are working well, we'll succeed at fitting those pieces together and in ways that are orderly and that create some kind of recognizable pattern. What's interesting about this, though, is that thinking about the economy this way, one implication is that we might not need to use all the pieces at any one time to generate a recognizable and desirable pattern. The goal for this kind of jigsaw puzzle isn't necessarily to just use all the pieces, but to use the pieces that fit together that generate a meaningful pattern. And one of the ways of understanding the boom that produced this bust and our subsequent slow recovery is that those artificially low interest rates generated by the central bank and the interventions in housing markets weaken the prices and profit signals across the marketplace that inform us of whether the pieces really fit together. And the result was, during the first decade of the century, we built a puzzle that used all the pieces, or at least almost all the pieces, but again, crammed them together, forced them together in ways that didn't produce a recognizable pattern, right? We were trying to put a square peg in a round hole. It didn't work. The economy's productive structure was not, again to use this word, sustainable. That was not real growth, as we began to discover, again, 2007, 2008. What has happened in the recession is an attempt to dismantle that puzzle, to pull those kind of crammed together pieces apart and now figure out where they should really go. What recovery is taking those pieces and trying to put them back together to create a new, meaningful pattern. At least that's the way it should work, okay? Where we are now, in a world of high unemployment rates and low investment, is the equivalent of a lot of those puzzle pieces sitting around the room not being fit together. And the problem here is that something's preventing us from really two things. One, pulling the pieces apart to get them out of the unsustainable pattern, and then figuring out where they ought to go instead. And it's those two important parts of the process that we've cut short with misguided government policy. And let me talk a little bit about that. When Krugman, of course, argues that pretty much any spending will do. And this is, by the way, why Krugman has made what we think of these as sort of ridiculous arguments, saying that, well, yeah, if there was a threat of a space aliens invasion, that would be great for the economy. Okay, because we just start spending all these resources protecting ourselves against some alien invasion. He's made the same point about wars, right? Even if we grant him that he's being somewhat tongue-in-cheek or doesn't think wars are great, it's not clear. Okay, but yeah, wars are great because they get us to spend money and activate all these resources and so on. Notice, by the way, aside from the ridiculousness of the space aliens argument, notice the assumption again that the resources that are lying around, right, are resources that could be used for those purposes. Okay? Krugman and people like him either ignore the specificity of capital and labor, or just assume they know best how those things should be used. Okay? The problem is that it's not that any spending will do. Because what we're going to do if we just spend on anything is once again try to cram those puzzle pieces together in ways that don't fit, that aren't sustainable, and we'll find ourselves right back in the mess that we're in right now. Again, the point is not just to use pieces of the puzzle, but to ensure that they fit together in ways that work. And again, the assumption in most stimulus spending is that they're projects just waiting to be pursued if we only would spend the money. Right? Shovel ready, as we call them in the United States. What's overlooked is whether the capital and labor that are idle are the resources best suited to produce to those projects. Not to mention whether consumers and citizens even want those outputs in the first place. Just buying, hiring, and producing for the sake of, quote, doing something will create a structure of production that's quickly found to be unsustainable. There might be a few, again, quote, shovel-ready projects, okay? But most things will require things like engineers and others to do the planning. If the unemployed are construction workers and you can't put them to work until somebody plans out the project, it's not going to work, especially if you can't find those engineers at wages that are reasonable and so on. This is not going to reduce unemployment. And this has been part of the problem in the United States. Where that stimulus money has been spent hasn't been the places where unemployed people are, right? And we shouldn't be surprised by this. Governments aren't very good at figuring this stuff out. If the Austrian view is right, the only way to get this puzzle reassembled, and I'm kind of using that passive voice intentionally here, into a recognizable, sustainable pattern is through the decentralized actions of entrepreneurs guided by competitive market signals of prices, profits, and losses, and I'll say something more about the losses point in a minute. Politicians don't have those signals. They don't have the signals of the marketplace. They don't have the incentives of the marketplace to figure out which projects are the sustainable ones. Entrepreneurs and others do, if you simply let markets do their job. What markets do is help us overcome that ignorance by providing us with the signals, again, with prices, profits, and loss signals to help us figure this all out. And the result of this, of course, by the way, is that when politicians don't know what the right answer is, what the sort of economically correct or rational answer is, they politicize the process. And so what we've seen happen in the United States, as we've seen elsewhere, is so-called stimulus projects wind up magically being spent on the home districts of particular representatives with enough power to influence it, right? So what we see happen is people can't wonder, why is it this was supposed to be stimulus, but why are all the roads in Senator whatever's state getting all the money? This is a feature, not a bug, as far as the politicians are concerned. This is what they want to do. And the fact that they don't have any way of knowing for sure what the objectively right answer is why we see it happen. The other problem we're seeing right now is that current policies, the argument's been made that current policies in the United States and elsewhere are generating significant regime uncertainty. And that's a phrase that the economist Robert Higgs coined. Regime uncertainty really refers to that people don't know what the rules of the game are. And if people don't know what the rules of the game are, they're not going to play. So there's really two, I think, kind of forms of regime uncertainty that we see. One is what we might call sort of zigzagging policy. When governments have one policy, then abruptly change their mind and do something else, the private sector kind of says, oh, we don't know what they're doing, right? So let's just wait till they at least stop or stay on one path for a while. The other kind, and I think the more severe kind of regime uncertainty, is when politicians suggest that private sector investors will not be able to reap the benefits of their investments. When we talk about raising taxes, when we talk about increasing the corporate income tax, when we get the kind of anti-business rhetoric that we've heard from the Obama administration and others across the world that suggests that somehow the private sector creation of wealth is the problem here and that business people are the problem and so on. We saw this in the United States in the 1930s under President Roosevelt. And there's pretty good evidence to suggest that that rhetoric and the policies that went with them in the 30s extended the Great Depression longer than it would have otherwise been. And we may well be the same thing here too. The other problem, of course, are all the bailouts. As I said earlier, you need to have losses. The market capitalism is not just a profit system, it's a profit and loss system. And if we don't allow companies to go out of business that make mistakes, we can't pull apart the wrong jigsaw puzzle. We can't pull apart the pieces that have been crammed together. The only way to build to get sustainable economic growth is if those pieces can fit. And if the pieces are stuck together and we can't pull them apart through bankruptcy and so forth, we're never going to see meaningful recovery. There's no doubt that recessions are painful. They simply are, okay? But they are the price we have to pay for the mistakes of the boom. There's no way to correct mistakes without some pain being involved. And this is not something, I'm happy to talk about this in the Q&A, but I'm not going to say much more about it now, which should lead us to be asking questions about what sorts of institutional changes do we have to make in order to prevent this kind of thing from happening again. I'm doing a talk at lunchtime tomorrow at the Legatum Institute where I'm going to address the sort of longer run question. So let me wrap up with what I think is an under-asked question, an under-answered question by people like me who are critics of Krugman and so on. All right, so what can we do, right? Is it a council of despair, as people said about Hayek in the 1930s? I don't think it is. I think the answer lies in the criticism. It is not, quote, doing nothing to argue that we should be freeing up competition, prices, profits, and losses, so that entrepreneurs and others can finish the process of tearing down the mistakes of the boom and figure out how to allocate those resources to their new best uses. Too often the question, what can we do or what should we do, the implicit we is, what should government do? Okay? And my answer to that is, that's the wrong question, or at least the wrong noun, okay? The real question is that we, quote, we can do lots, meaning we, as in entrepreneurs in the private sector, can do lots if government gets out of the way. They're the ones, private sector is the ones that can pull apart the mistakes and rebuild that puzzle in a sustainable way. But we got to get out of their way. We need politicians to stop meddling in the marketplace. We need central banks to get to be constrained, to stop credit expansion, to stop to not keep interest rates artificially low any longer. We need to allow bankrupt firms to actually go bankrupt, to sell off those assets and get them reallocated to more valuable uses. We need to make sure that we tone down the rhetoric, that we understand the importance of the private sector, that we keep we stop punishing people for success, and that we try to encourage private sector investment. What people like Krugman frequently argue is it doesn't much matter where the investment comes from, whether it's the G or the I, right? And what I want to argue is it matters a whole lot. Government simply cannot make the kinds of investments that are sustainable in the long run the way the private sector can. And again, we need to address that regime uncertainty problem by getting consistency in policy, by reducing regulation, and by, again, signaling to private investors it's okay to come back, it's okay to make a legitimate profit. Demonizing legitimate profit seeking was a disaster in the 1930s, and it will continue to be a disaster today. Before the advent of Keynesian thinking, before the kinds of ways that Krugman and others think about the world, most, though not all, most recessions were short-lived, though steep, but short-lived, as producers were left free to shuffle the jigsaw pieces into better combinations. But for a whole bunch of interesting historical reasons, in the 30s, for perhaps understandably, though this was even building up before that, people began to lose their trust in the market's ability to do that and lose patience with the process of readjustment, and began to believe that the way to solve these problems was through the political process, through stimulus spending, through this sorts of activist Keynesianism that now, again, which we thought was dead, has come back to life. What's ironic here is that the advocates of stimulus spending have what I would call a misguided lack of trust in markets and a misguided trust in the political process. The political process simply can't do the job that markets can. And it's Hayek and it's the Austrians that give us good reason to think that, despite the platform that people like Krugman have at the New York Times to say otherwise. So let me stop there. I'm happy to take that. Try to untangle myself from my microphone.
You happen to go on until 12:30 taking questions?
12:30, sure.
Great, sure.
Sir.
Several questions. First of all, presumably from what you said, Krugman would disagree with Bastiat about the broken window. He would say it's good to break the window, so...
Yep. Or here, let me give that the best reading I can, right? Which is, and there's a very fascinating debate going on in the economics blogs in the last few weeks over exactly this question. Matt Iglesias has been the one sort of arguing the Krugman that it's really not, it's not a violation of the broken window fallacy. People like Sheldon Richman and some others have been arguing the other side. Very interesting debate is going on, and also Brian Kaplan maybe too. Yeah, Brian Kaplan was the one who kind of started it. What I think the argument on the other side is, well, okay, but if there's idle, what they'll say is if there's idle resources, right, then there maybe isn't that opportunity cost. In other words, if the glazier is sitting around or not doing any business, or if the shop owner, right, has nothing else to spend on, right, then this can generate. And I think the response to that is exactly the argument I made today, which is how do we, saying there's idle resources doesn't tell us anything about the particulars of those resources and whether that spending will actually bring them in a way breaking the window will generate spending, but it doesn't tell us that that's sustainable kind of spending. And if, again, the question of how those resources get used. Let me kind of do a little riff here for a second. I think that part of the problem here is in the early 20th century, there was this great push to be able to make economics more, quote, scientific and more measurable. And sort of the work with aggregates became a kind of, here's what we can measure, so let's build a theory around what we can measure, right? Seems backwards to me, okay, but I think there was some of that going on, right? And it's, once you do that, then you get focused on these aggregates and you lose the whole Austrian argument that the intricacies matter and how the puzzle pieces fit together matter. That's much harder to measure and sort of treat, quote unquote, and I'd say quote unquote scientifically, but it doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means it's different. So yeah, I think that's a good question to ask. I think they would say, well, what if there's idle resources? To which the response is, well, wait a second. Idle resources doesn't help us because we need to know how they fit. I'll get the second question too, then I want to get onto this one.
You talked about the fact that you've got construction workers, but maybe you want bankers.
Yeah.
So, I've always understood one of the outstanding qualities of the American labour force was its adaptability and malleability. Could you?
Yeah, and I think that's true. And a couple things. Certainly, it's much easier in the United States to fire workers than it is in most of Europe, which is really important. I mean, if you want to understand why natural rates of unemployment and for long-term unemployment in Europe is a bigger problem, one reason is that if you can't fire people, you won't hire them. Analogy. What will happen to marriage rates if we make divorce tougher? Marriage rates will go down. People say, well, what if I'm wrong? I can't get divorced. I'm stuck with this person, right? I'm less likely to marry them. Okay, so it's the same kind of logic, right? So you're right, and it's true. The labor force is fairly malleable, but not perfectly so. It takes time to turn construction workers into bankers, or better yet, to turn bankers into whatever. Okay, and so and beyond all that, how do we know what they should be turning into? That's got to be guided by all these market signals. And if government steps in and say, well, we know, of course, we need to turn all the bankers into, into retail clerks or something, right? They don't know. The only guidance we have are sort of where the legitimate profit signals are. So it's true. There's no way to avoid the pain of recession. The other analogy, and people like Krugman frequently pick on Austrians for using this analogy because they misunderstand it. But there's truth to it, which is, look, if you go home tonight and start drinking after dinner, okay, and keep drinking and drinking, you're going to be hungover tomorrow. You just are. Your body has to get rid of that alcohol somehow. It's going to be unpleasant, right? And if you said, well, geez, I'm feeling terrible the next day after drinking, I better start drinking again, right? Because that'll help. Well, no, actually, you're just going to make it worse again. So you can't, once you have the artificial, unsustainable boom, the price of the bust has to be paid somehow. The question is, can we make it shorter and quicker? And I think historically, those recoveries were much quicker and didn't linger on. And this one is lingering on. And I didn't include the graph. There's a wonderful graph that's sort of the length of how long it took employment to recover after a recession. And this recession in the US is just way worse than anything we've ever seen. I think because we've just prevented those market signals from letting people know how to adjust.
And one more, sorry, very quick one. About regime stability. You didn't mention, but I would have thought it was the worst thing of all, really, the danger of retrospective taxation, changing the rules.
Yes. Anytime that's in play, that's awful.
India.
The other one that I didn't mention that I mentioned in previous versions of this talk is so-called Obamacare, because it was always about what would the Supreme Court say. Though saying that, I would say now, even though the Supreme Court has stamped it okay, there's still a great deal of uncertainty about exactly what it means, about exactly how the details of regulations will play out. So that's another one in here too. Yes, sir. In blue.
Yeah. You mentioned that it's during the boom times that mistakes are made. Mm-hmm. I would have thought that if that's so, then economists ought to work out what these mistakes were and predict that there is going to be a recession. Now, I noticed there's not many economists who did do that. There was one Australian economist, I think it's Professor Steve Keen, and he predicted before this it was unsustainable, the housing. He happens to be a sort of a Keynesian economist, plus he's got some other ideas. And I'm wondering why economists, particularly from your point of view, didn't predict this and say...
There were some who did. I mean, I can name a few off the top of my head. Peter Schiff sort of is a guy who's on TV a lot. He's not an academic economist, but he's a sort of investment guy, knows the Austrian story very well. And he was sending up, you can find these clips on YouTube of him for several years before saying this was going to happen. And I think the problem is that we, meaning people sympathetic to my argument, we can say things, the joke is Austrian economists have predicted 17 of the last 5 recessions, right? Okay, and the problem is that we can say things like this boom is unsustainable because we can look at those interest rates, we can look at what the Fed's done, we can look at the artificial housing stuff and say, this can't last. The economy is simply too complex for us to say, one, point to them as specific mistakes. We can say we're over-investing in housing. Okay, we can say that, but we can't. Is that one of them, or is that one real, or is that we can't say that? The other thing we can't predict with any precision is when the turning point will happen. What we can't say is, and that's why I predicted 17 of the last 5 recessions, because we keep saying things like there's going to be a recession, there's going to be a recession. That's the best we can do. It's what Hayek would call a pattern prediction, simply because the complexity of the system is such we can't say with any expertise or any sort of confidence where and when that turning point will be. And I think the real problem, one of the real problems with economics these days, is economists are deeply lacking in humility. Okay, and they simply, too many economists, Krugman, whomever else you want to name, simply believe they have the tools to make these kind of scientific predictions. And as a result of that, the public expects us to, right? And so when economists say, well, it's like the weathermen saying, well, it's going to be sunny one of these days, right? It's not very helpful, okay? And I think when economists say, look, there's, people like me say, this will lead to a recession, we're expected to be able to predict, like, predicting a lunar eclipse or something. We just can't do that. And we got to stop pretending we can, because we set ourselves up for just this kind of failure where people say, well, you guys should have been able to figure this out. And I think that's it's a tricky position to be, to be able to make this kind of broad prediction with some confidence, but not to be able to do so precisely. Yes, sir.
I've forgotten which one of your presidents it was that he only wanted one-armed economists. So
yeah.
Say on the one hand.
That's all right. Truman. That was Harry Truman said.
Even though you're.
Yeah. If you laid all the economists end to end, you still wouldn't reach a conclusion, right?
We need more economist jokes and fewer economists, perhaps.
I'm not going to argue with you as long as I'm one of them, because my wages will go up.
It's interesting how much of what you said seemed to hold sway over here as well. We have a business secretary who clearly doesn't believe that making more difficult to fire people will actually help. We certainly have a central bank governor who does not lack for. But humility, let's say, is not his best quality. But why, after 5 years, when we've had, here, massive fiscal stimulus, interest rates of just 0.5%, quantitative easing 375 billion, why are the Keynesians still holding sway? Why are there not more people able to see that they have got it wrong? We seem to be going into an environment where people are starting to blame capitalism, which is going to make things even more difficult.
Who was it? Einstein that said, what's the line about repeatedly doing the same thing, expecting different results? I think I don't have one good, quippy answer to that question, but I think there's a couple things to think about. Politicians like Keynesianism. It flatters them, it gives them power, it lets them do the things they want. It provides an intellectual justification for the things they'd like to do anyway, which is to spend money, not tax, and spend it on their constituents. And Keynesianism says not only is that good politics, it's good economics. Okay, and so I think part of it is that's it. I think the other part of it is that in the media, it's kind of folk economics. It's not, back to Bastiat, it's not seeing the unseen, right? It's the idea that, oh, what's wrong with the economy? Well, it's slow because people aren't spending money, right? When people spend money, that's what generates jobs and jobs. So we need more spending, okay? And it's a very kind of crude observation that doesn't understand, well, wait a second, not all spending is the same, right? Creating more money isn't the same as generating real, not savings and not that. So I think it's all those kind of fallacies mixed up together. One of the most depressing things for me in the last 5 years, I'm joking about it, is that I really did think that we had killed off some of the worst, this crude Keynesianism. But boy, it came back with a vengeance. Again, politicians love it. It came back, the media loves it because it's an easy story. The story I just told, not so easy to tell in a 30-second soundbite. All right, so I think there's all of those things happening. And I still think there is a kind of intellectual bias among people that says economies are like machines. That if we just tweak the dials the right way, we can make it run. And they're not. They're much more like, organic, living, complex phenomena, right? They're evolutionary. We just don't know enough to treat them like a machine. But Keynesianism makes it sound simple, and I think that also fits a much, that kind of narrative. And it's, the recession has been really, really bad for a lot of people. It's been really great for me, right? Because I get to do this, right? And the irony is, the more fallacies that get out there in the common, in the media, the more that you hopefully have a demand for fallacy busters. As my friend Art Carden said, the great thing about economics is that, how do you put it? He says, sacred cows make the best tasting burgers. So here we are. Yes, sir.
Thank you for that incredibly lucid analysis, which I found compelling. But what I'd like to know is how your analysis fits in with standard monetarist theory, which suggests that it's incumbent on the central bank, faced with a violent contraction in credit and money, to counter it with negative interest rates and an expansion of money through asset purchases and so on and so forth. Because no central banker would argue that they can cure the problem.
Right.
All they're trying to do is smooth the adjustment and prevent a sort of outbreak of mass bankruptcies and mass unemployment.
The set of issues this pulls in is so complex and is so under debate right now in so many places. I'm going to try to do it justice in a couple minutes. I think a couple things I'd say. This is where my specialty is in monetary policy type stuff. So I love these questions. I think the first, given a world of central banks, I think the first obligation that central banks have in these kind of situations is to make sure that the money supply doesn't fall. We don't want a repeat of the 1930s in the United States, right, where the Fed allowed this calamitous decrease in the money supply and aggravated the very problems that you're talking about. So we want to have a central bank that doesn't let that happen. At the same time, we don't want a central bank, I think, that sees its job as to come in and sort of inflate our way out of the results of a previous inflation. And threading that needle is very difficult. And central banks love to say, you can't get out of crises with us. And the line I have in a recent piece was that, look, it's like, you got to remember, central banks are arsonists disguised as firefighters, right? They come in and say, I'm the only one who can put out that fire. And you go, aren't you the one who started it? Yeah. So, so we have to be real. And once we have central banks, they're politicized. There's all the other problems we have to deal with. And it gets very, very tricky about what we should do. Knowing whether we've done too much in one direction or another, again, I don't think there's easy answers to this. If I could rewind to the fall of 2008, all right, and if I had the czar of the Fed, God forbid, right? What might we have done, at least in the U.S., is I think what we could have done is followed the classic rule of central banking, which is in a crisis, you make loans available, liquidity available to healthy banks at a penalty rate. You don't do what they did, which was to shovel money at bankrupt banks, right? We had to get an orderly bankruptcy process for dealing with them. And what you don't do is to keep shoveling at it and keep buying up all this toxic nonsense off their balance sheets afterwards. I think if we'd done that, we could have prevented any damaging deflation, but avoided some of the mistakes we've made now, and Bernanke and others may have painted themselves into a corner with what they ended up doing. But there's no easy way to know what that is, and there's a big debate, even among very market-friendly people, over what the Fed should have done, what should it do now. There's a school of thought, the so-called market monetarists, Scott Sumner and people like this, who are arguing that we need significant monetary expansion to generate nominal GDP growth to get us back to where we should be. There's people like George Selgin and others who I'm more sympathetic to, who have argued, no, that assumes that we sort of haven't had all these adjustments. Those adjustments may have taken place already. We're on a kind of new path, and that's just going to aggravate things. This is a very subtle, complex debate. But I think the best advice to central banks is first, do no harm. Don't let the deflation happen. But boy, what we've seen, I think, them actually do is way more than that. Aside from the fact that they've done it in the case of the Fed by taking on a whole bunch of new powers they never had before without congressional approval that aren't going to go away when this is over, and that's a problem too. I know you're waiting patiently in front.
Yes, I was going to ask about international trade, because one way potentially to increase output would be to free up trade to get more trading activity rather than just focus in the national market on the Keynesian model. What is it that seems to prevent any government making any progress in that respect at any time in history almost?
Politics. I mean, I think, trade restrictions, concentrated benefits, dispersed costs, politicians want to, I grew up in the Detroit area, right? If you're a politician from Michigan, free trade and the auto industry was, thought to be horrible because it was going to drive them all to bankruptcy. Guess what? We had free trade. GM did go bankrupt. By the way, it's going bankrupt again, despite being now government motors, as we call it. So much for government picking winners, by the way, too. That was, whatever else you want to say. What Obama's saying, the bailout of GM was great. Actually, no, it's on the verge of bankruptcy. So I think that's part of the answer is that the good economics is bad politics, bad economics is good politics, and I think that's an issue. But you're absolutely right. That would help. And I mean, even if we weren't in a recession, more international trade, good thing. But certainly now it would help. Sure.
You've argued today that the appropriate response to a recession, the bursting of an asset bubble, is to allow for the rationalization of malinvestment that took place during the boom time. And I think the words you used, if I'm paraphrasing, were to allow for an orderly process of failing companies to fail, for the assets to be reallocated to more productive uses in the economy. We're now in 2012, 4 years after Lehman Brothers went bust, and apart from the parts that got cherry-picked by Barcap and Nomura, all the remaining assets are still going through bankruptcy court. That doesn't strike me as a expedient and early process. So is the bankruptcy process one that is right-sized for an Austrian recovery?
I think it's a great question. There was a lot of talk at the time in 2008 about whether there was a way to do expedited bankruptcy for those financial firms. And it just never went anywhere because we just didn't let it happen, right? For so many other firms. But I think you're quite right, and one of the problems here is that this is a crisis like we've never quite seen before in having the sort of overlay of a significant recession and this huge financial crisis with these complex instruments on top of it. We certainly had bank failures, say, in the 1930s, that was a different time, more simple story, right? And they were almost all small, one-office banks. Now it's global banking structures that are, again, I don't have a good answer for that other than to say, I think the point you raise is a really good one, and that as we might want to think about, God forbid we get something like this again, how do we have a kind of way of expediting bankruptcy for financial firms that won't tie up those assets for so long, right? But again, that's an interesting